I never imagined I'd stand there helpless, watching machines devour my family's cornfield like it was nothing more than a development project waiting to happen. The ground they tore through wasn't just land. It was memory. It was sacrifice. It was legacy. That soil had been in our family for over 100 years. My grandfather, Elijah Mercer, came to Elk Hollow, Colorado, in 1903 with nothing but a mule, a worn Bible, and a pocket full of grit. He bought 120 acres with every dime he'd saved working the rail lines. He believed in building something that would outlive him. And he did. He raised my father on that land. My father raised me. We weren't just farmers. We were caretakers of history. Each season, we planted more than crops. We planted intention, pride, and hope. When the droughts of the 1930s hit, and most families around us packed up and left, my grandfather stayed. He'd haul water by the bucket in the dead of night just to keep a single row of corn alive. He wasn't just stubborn. He was rooted here, the same way our heritage corn was. Over the years, the world around us changed. What once was wide, open farmland slowly shrank. Highways crept closer. Then came the strip malls, the subdivisions, the HOA-controlled neighborhoods with their vinyl fences and manicured laws. And still, our 120 acres held fast, until only 25 remained. But even then, we made it work. We adapted. I began cultivating specialty heritage corn, the kind with stories in its seeds. Varieties you won't find in any supermarket. Varieties that chefs and universities sought out because of their rarity, their richness, their history. Our little operation didn't just survive, it thrived. In fact, some of the new neighbors seemed to admire what we were doing. I'd wave to them as I worked. Kids from the subdivision would stop by with their parents to see what real corn looked like. For a moment, it felt like coexistence might be possible. And then she arrived, Marissa Langford, the new president of the Summit Creek Homeowners Association. Sharp suits, colder smile, and a background in commercial real estate. From the moment she set foot in that neighborhood, I could tell. She didn't see a legacy. She saw leverage. She didn't look at my cornfield and see something sacred. She saw a blank canvas, a future expansion lot. She never came right out and said it, not at first, but I saw it in her eyes. The way she'd pause at the edge of her neatly paved road, sunglasses glinting, as if calculating the value of every stalk of corn I had left. And then one afternoon it began. A knock at the door. I opened it to find her standing there, flawless and perfumed, handing me a sleek folder with manicured fingers. "We'd like to make an offer on your remaining acreage," she said, her voice polite, and completely empty of warmth. "It's a generous proposal. You might want to consider it. This area is changing." I glanced at the number inside and laughed, loudly. It was an insult, 60% below market value. When I handed the folder back, her smile cracked just slightly. "You should think about it," she said again, her tone turning sharper. "This neighborhood is moving forward. Some things, some people just get left behind." And with that, she turned on her heels and walked away, leaving behind the faint scent of her perfume and the first spark of the fight she didn't yet know she'd started. What she couldn't have guessed, what she never bothered to ask, was that my land wasn't just dirt. It was protected, not just by history, not just by blood, but by law. Because beneath that cornfield, running like an invisible river through time, was a century-old drainage easement, one legally recorded and still binding, one her contractors, her board, and maybe even she, had no idea existed. She thought her pressure, her threats, her bulldozers would force me to fold. What she didn't know was that the roots of this farm go deeper than any blueprint she could file. The day after Marissa's visit, I found myself staring out over the cornfield, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted. The sky was clear, the wind was soft, but I knew in my bones we were standing on the edge of something. And sure enough, the storm didn't take long to roll in. At first, it was subtle. A letter, folded neatly and stamped with the HOA's emblem, arrived in my mailbox. Inside, a formal complaint about agricultural odors drifting into the neighborhood. I read it twice, then once more just to make sure I wasn't imagining things. Odors? From corn? We hadn't used chemical fertilizers in over 30 years. Every practice on my farm was organic, sustainable, and thoroughly documented. Our fields didn't stink, they breathed. And yet, there it was in black and white, the star of their paper trail. A few days later came another letter, this time about unapproved noise levels for my tractor. The same tractor that had been in use for decades, humming through dawn mist and twilight sun like a heartbeat across the soil. Neighbors used to wave when they heard it. Now, they were calling it a disturbance. It didn't take long before I saw what was really happening. Marissa wasn't trying to negotiate. She was trying to break me, one complaint at a time. She was painting a picture of a farm out of sync with the community, of an operation too messy, too loud, too inconvenient for the world she wanted to build. And behind the curtain, I could feel her moving chess pieces I didn't even know existed. Zoning inspectors started showing up without warning, cameras in hand, clipboards ready. They asked about runoff, pesticides, irrigation. Each time, I answered calmly. Each time, they found nothing. But each visit cost me time, money, peace of mind. I had to shut down operations for hours, reschedule deliveries, push back planting. The worst part wasn't the inspections. It was realizing they were coming from anonymous tips. I didn't have to guess who was behind them. Then, late one morning, I caught a young man photographing the side of my barn at sunrise. I approached him calmly, asked if he was lost. He looked nervous, said he was documenting potential code violations for the HOA. When pressed, he admitted Marissa had hired him. That same afternoon, I drove straight to the courthouse and filed for a restraining order. But the damage was compounding. My irrigation lines, slashed, twice, deliberate cuts. The security cameras I'd installed to catch whoever was behind it, disabled, wires neatly severed. And then came the tire tracks, deep, angry ruts through a portion of my eastern plot. Someone had driven to my cornfield under cover of night, crushing a quarter-acre of heritage corn. That corn wasn't just produce. It was a promise to chefs who'd placed orders months in advance, a promise to researchers from 2 different universities studying our seed lineage, a promise to myself. They thought these tactics would break my spirit. They didn't know me. I started documenting everything, every complaint, every call, every damage pipe and slash line, timestamps, photos, witness statements. If they wanted a legal war, I was going to bring one to their doorstep. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any more twisted, I discovered the truth. A friend of mine, Caleb, who worked in county records, pulled me aside one evening. "Colton," he said, "you need to know something. I overheard Marissa talking to a developer. She's not just trying to buy your land. She's trying to connect it." "Connect it?" I asked. "She wants to link Summit Creek to a new subdivision going in north of you. Your farm sits right in the middle of that plan." I stood there, stunned. This wasn't about inconvenience. It was about profit. She wasn't trying to preserve peace. She was carving out a path for herself, for her investors, for another block of overpriced homes with granite countertops and zero soul. To her, my land wasn't sacred. It was strategic. When I confronted her days later, she didn't even flinch. "Your family's little corn patch is standing in the way of progress," she said flatly. "This isn't 1950, Mr. Mercer. People want shopping centers and dog parks, not cornfields." I remember the way her voice curled around the word cornfields, like it was something dirty, something outdated. But to me, it wasn't just a word. It was a birthright. My father used to say, "We're not in the business of crops. We're in the business of keeping history alive." And I wasn't about to let a real estate parasite with a nameplate and a gavel wipe out a century of our blood and sweat. We'd survived dust storms. We'd survived Wall Street buyouts of local farms. We'd survived every trick the modern world threw at us. Now we had to survive her. What Marissa didn't realize was that behind every stalk of corn, every tractor run, every sunburned hand, there was something much harder to move. It was a bright spring morning when everything fell apart. A day I should have remembered for joy, a celebration, not devastation. My daughter, Natalie, was graduating with her doctorate in agricultural science. the first in our family to earn a PhD. I wore my best suit, the one I save for weddings, funerals, and moments that mean something. I was a proud father, sitting in the audience, watching her step onto that stage, the tassels swaying with each stride. My heart felt so full I thought it might burst. That degree? It wasn't just hers. It belonged to my father, to his father, to every calloused hand that turned soil and made life grow. But while I was clapping for her, my world was being destroyed back home. I hadn't checked my phone once during the ceremony. Didn't want to be distracted. But when I finally pulled it out, 12 missed texts from my neighbor, Ethan. Where are you? They're at your farm. Bulldozers. Call me. ASAP. My hands went numb. I sprinted out of the auditorium, tie flapping in the wind, not even stopping to shake my daughter's hand. The hour drive home felt like a blur, every turn tighter, every red light unbearable. My knuckles were white on the wheel. And then I saw it. As I crested the hill just outside my property line, the dust cloud rose like smoke from a fire. They were tearing it all up. Bulldozers, earth movers, work crews in bright orange vests. My cornfield, gone. Row after row, crushed under treads and machinery. I slammed on the brakes and flew out of the truck, still in my suit, shoes sunk into dirt that had been alive with heritage crops just days ago. A sheriff's cruiser blocked my driveway. I recognized the man. Sheriff Monroe. Known him for 20 years. He looked away when I met his eyes. Colton, he said, soft and ashamed. I'm sorry. There's a county order. Judge signed off. My hands are tied. He handed me a document. I barely saw through the red cloud in my vision. And then I saw her, Marissa Langford, standing near the equipment, arms crossed, looking like she'd just finished closing a $1 million deal. Her jacket was spotless. Her heels were sunk slightly in the dirt, but she didn't seem to notice. She didn't look at the corn. She looked at me. Perhaps now, she said, brushing dust off her sleeve, you'll consider our standing offer. Her tone was clinical, pleased. Then came the final twist of the knife. Of course, she added. The price isn't adjusted downward, considering the cost of this necessary cleanup operation. Cleanup? She called it a cleanup, as if what they'd just done was tidy, as if they hadn't just annihilated 5 acres of rare heritage corn. Crops worth over $75,000. Crops that were already contracted to restaurants, to schools, to buyers who cherish what we grew. I stared at the document in my hands, trying to make sense of it through the fury. It cited some obscure visual nuisance ordinance, written in 1954, still on the county books. Apparently, my farm, my corn, had been declared a blight on neighborhood aesthetics. No mention of crop value. No mention of agricultural rights. Just visual standards. Marissa, smug as ever, pointed to a tiny, easily missed line in a week-old classified newspaper. Public notice of hearing on community beautification enforcement, scheduled for April 14th. That was the exact date of my daughter's graduation. A date I had mentioned, out loud, at a community meeting 2 months prior. They knew I'd be gone. They planned for me to be gone. They orchestrated the entire ambush with surgical precision. By sunset, the field was flattened. 5 acres of generational work. Gone. My hands were trembling as I stood there in my dust-covered suit, tie loosened, jaw clenched. The stalks lay broken like bones across the soil. The sheriff approached me again before leaving. Off the record, he murmured, lowering his voice. This ain't right, but their paperwork's solid. Someone powerful made this happen fast. I said nothing. I just picked up one broken cornstalk. It was limp, splintered, still green. This isn't over, I whispered to myself. But I didn't know how to fight back. Not yet, not against this. I'd played by the rules my whole life, paid every tax, filed every zoning document, worked with the land, not against it. But this wasn't a neighborly dispute. This was a hostile takeover. That night, I sat in my kitchen, the silence louder than any protest. My boots were still covered in soil from the destroyed field. The contract buyers would be calling any day now, asking why their orders wouldn't be filled. The bank, well, the mortgage payment depended on that crop. I looked at the numbers. $75,000 in lost revenue, with zero warning, zero chance to salvage even a single seed. The phone rang. It was the bank. I let it go to voicemail. Then I walked into my grandfather's old study. The air smelled like cedar and old books. His Bible sat where it always did, on the desk beneath the window. I opened it, looking for comfort. What I found instead was a note tucked into the back, in his handwriting. This land is your legacy. Never surrender what you can't replace. My hands were shaking. Behind that note, more papers. Faded, yellow with age. I almost missed them. A survey map from 1937. Detailed, precise. And there it was. A line, faint but clearly marked. A drainage easement, legally recorded, running directly through what was now Summit Creek HOA land. The clubhouse, the park, maybe even Marissa's precious town square. Suddenly, I could breathe again, because in that moment, I realized something Marissa Langford didn't know, something her bulldozers couldn't bury. She destroyed my crops, but in doing so, she unearthed my greatest weapon. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, staring at the brittle survey map I'd found tucked inside my grandfather's Bible. A map drawn in ink now faded to sepia, showing the lay of the land as it once was and as it legally still was. The drainage easement line ran clean across the northeast corner of our property, then cut diagonally, right under Summit Creek's glittering clubhouse. It was no mistake, no trick of old paper. It was law, signed, stamped, filed with the county in 1937, and, most importantly, never extinguished. For the first time in weeks, I felt something deeper than anger, deeper than grief. I felt hope. That morning, I climbed into the attic of the old barn. The air was thick with dust and memory. My grandfather's steamer trunk sat beneath a beam of early sunlight, just where it always had. I opened it carefully, half expecting to find only rusted tools and water-stained letters. But what I found instead was a gold mine. Dozens of documents, carefully preserved, property tax receipts going back to the 1920s, water usage records, correspondence with county engineers, even photographs from the original installation of the drainage channels, black and white and grainy but unmistakable. And there, in a worn envelope labeled Easement, Keep Safe, I found the final piece, the original sign agreement. It detailed the granting of the easement in exchange for water access rights to our farm, a crucial lifeline during the droughts of the 30s. The language was clear. The right to maintain and utilize the drainage path would continue in perpetuity for the benefit of Elijah Mercer and his heirs. That meant it was all still valid. No formal abandonment, no recorded cancellation. And more than that, it wasn't just ink on paper. It was reinforced by decades of history, documents, and physical proof. They'd built on it, without permission, without disclosure, without even checking records. And that mistake? It wasn't just arrogant. It was legally catastrophic. I drove straight to the county records office. The clerk, a woman named Becca, helped me pull the property records. She raised an eyebrow as I laid the original easement on her desk. "Where did you get this?" she asked. "My grandfather," I said softly. "He kept everything." She flipped through the pages, her expression changing from casual interest to concern. "This was never extinguished," she murmured. "They should have accounted for it during permitting. If they didn't, well, that's serious." Together, we traced a chain of ownership. The easement had quietly passed through every generation, never mentioned, never revoked. And when Summit Creek was developed, the builder had marked no existing easements on their permit forms. That wasn't just a clerical error. It was willful omission. I requested aerial photos from the county surveyor, images from the 1950s and 60s. There was, clear as day, the original drainage channel, snaking across the land before the foundations of Summit Creek had even been poured. They had erased history. But history doesn't stay buried forever. I made a call to Ellen Becker, a friend of my late father's and one of the top water rights attorneys in the state. She arrived that same afternoon, sharp-eyed and steady, the kind of woman who knew every inch of the law and every trick developers tried to pull. We sat at my table, paper spread like a battlefield map. She read through everything in silence, then looked up at me. "This easement," she said, tapping the 1937 agreement, "is airtight, still valid, still binding, and it was never disclosed." "What does that mean?" I asked. She smiled for the first time. A slow, quiet smile, the kind that says justice is coming. "It means they built their pride and joy, clubhouse, playground, parking lot, on land they had no legal right to obstruct. And if they try to fight it," she leaned back, folding her hands, "they'll lose." I sat there for a long time, letting her words settle. All this time, I'd been playing defense, taking blows, watching my livelihood get dismantled, one insult, one bulldozer, one lie at a time. Now, the ground had shifted. Now, I had leverage. That night, I lit a fire in the living room hearth, something I hadn't done since the day my father passed. I poured a glass of his old rye whiskey and stood by the window, looking out over the ruined field. And for the first time since it all began, I didn't feel powerless. I felt prepared. Marissa thought she'd buried me under her rules, her committees, her polished lies. But she forgot something critical. The law doesn't just belong to those who write the biggest checks. Sometimes the law remembers things people want to forget. And now, it was my turn to remind them. The next morning, I was at the County Water Authority building before the doors unlocked. The sky was still heavy with morning fog, the kind that rolls low across Elk Hollow like a secret. I stood at the glass entrance, folders tucked beneath my arm, waiting for the clerk to flip the sign from closed to open. My boots tapped on the pavement, half from nerves, half from fury still simmering just under the surface. Inside, I met with a senior records officer, a man named Hal. He looked like he'd seen every land dispute from here to Durango, grizzled, gray-stubbled, skeptical by default. "Drainage easement, huh?" he muttered, adjusting his glasses as he looked at my paperwork. "From 1937? You're certain?" I laid out the documents, meticulously preserved, notarized, recorded, and backed by county maps, aerial photos, and legal definitions so old they might as well have been written in stone. Hal whistled through his teeth. Damn, this was never extinguished. Nobody ever filed to terminate it. Not once. His finger traced a path on the survey map. It cut across my land like a scar, clean, permanent, inarguable, and it went straight through Summit Creek's so-called crown jewel, the clubhouse, the very building they had used to host meetings, fundraisers, and, ironically, the events celebrating their so-called beautification initiative. They built over a registered drainage easement, Hal said, now fully engaged, and didn't disclose it on their permits. That's bad. How bad? I asked. Liability kind of bad, he said. Like, lawsuit, fine, possible insurance denial kind of bad. I nodded slowly. Now it was real. This wasn't just a historical oversight. It was a critical, legally binding screw-up on their part. A screw-up that could cost them everything. And I wasn't alone anymore. Ellen, who had already begun strategizing, took the reins like a general preparing for war. Together, we spent days piecing together a legal framework. Every document was copied, dated, notarized, and backed with evidence from county records. She filed official notices with the Planning Commission, Zoning Department, Water Authority, and, yes, the HOA itself. Each notice stated in formal and irrefutable language that I, Colton Mercer, heir to Elijah Mercer, would be exercising my full legal right to reestablish and utilize the original 1937 drainage easement for agricultural purposes. We mailed certified letters to every Summit Creek board member. Each envelope included copies of the easement, aerial photographs showing the historic flow, surveyor maps, citations from state water law, and a polite but unmistakably firm reminder that obstruction of a legally registered easement could result in legal and financial consequences. 3 days later, Marissa responded, not with a phone call, not with a meeting, with a single, condescending paragraph. The HOA does not recognize outdated easements that have been superseded by modern development. Any interference with community property will be met with immediate legal action. Ellen read it, then laughed aloud. She doesn't understand, she said, shaking her head. This isn't a matter of recognition. It's a matter of record. And in this state, water rights don't expire just because someone put in a putting green. To bolster our case, we hired an environmental engineer who specialized in historical water systems. He examined the topography, measured the grade, and cross-referenced everything against the original maps. His report was damning in the best possible way. The current clubhouse impedes the natural drainage flow established in 1937, it read. Construction occurred over an active easement without accommodation for historical runoff. This appears to violate local water management regulations. We didn't stop there. I brought in a licensed surveyor to mark the actual path of the easement. Neon-colored stakes appeared like breadcrumbs, leading from the edge of my property right to the HOA's prize lawn, parking lot, and clubhouse foundation. It was official, unavoidable, public. They'd built their empire on a foundation that wasn't theirs to claim. By the end of the week, every agency we'd notified had confirmed the same thing. The easement was valid. The HOA's development had failed to account for it. My legal rights stood undisturbed beneath everything they constructed. And just like that, the ground began to shift, only this time in my favor. Ellen was calm, methodical, and ruthless in her precision. She drafted a final, formal letter addressed to the HOA attorney, a man who, up to this point, had treated me like a backwoods nuisance. In it, we made our position clear. We would be restoring the natural flow of water. We would be reconnecting the historic drainage system. We would be doing so within the bounds of the law and in full compliance with agricultural codes. The letter ended with this. Failure to remove obstructions along the drainage path will be interpreted as unlawful interference with a recorded easement and will be pursued accordingly in court. The message was simple. They bulldozed my cornfield using legal loopholes. Now I was going to bury them, using the law itself, but not with vengeance, with righteous balance. They'd mistaken me for a relic, a man clutching the past. But what they didn't understand was that the past holds more power than they ever imagined. And in this case, the past was about to come flooding back. The moment I realized the law was on my side, something inside me shifted. For weeks, I've been reeling from the loss. 5 acres of rare heritage corn leveled in a single day, my livelihood torn up by machines and arrogance. But now, holding a binder of irrefutable proof, backed by county records, historical maps, and legal precedent, I began to feel a different emotion rise to the surface. Not just grief, not just anger, conviction, the kind you can't fake, the kind that only grows in the aftermath of injustice. The next step wasn't flashy. It wasn't theatrical. It was methodical, quiet, legal. I hired Owen Sutter, a local contractor whose family had worked agricultural land in Elk Hollow since the 1950s. He knew every twist of county code, every inch of topography from my back fence to the far ridge. When I showed him the easement path on the old 1937 survey, he gave a low whistle. "They built over this?" he asked, tracing the line that ran straight through the HOA's precious clubhouse. That's a hell of a mistake. Together, we began to restore the original drainage system. Nothing more, nothing less. We didn't dig a foot outside the documented path. Every trench, every culvert, every slope was measured against the original easement lines. We filed permits with the county, photographed each stage of the work, and posted legal notices as required. Ellen, my attorney, ensured every document was reviewed, notarized, and filed in triplicate. We dotted every I. We crossed every T. This wasn't just revenge. It was retribution that wore a suit and carried a clipboard. But the easement didn't just allow for drainage maintenance. Buried in the original language was a clause Marissa and her developer allies had clearly overlooked: the right to agricultural runoff. That changed everything. Because in legal terms, runoff includes waste generated by livestock, provided it's managed according to state and local regulations. So I made a decision, one that wasn't easy but necessary. I brought in 20 head of cattle and 50 pigs. It was the first time our land had held livestock in over a generation. My neighbor Todd, who raised hogs 2 counties over, helped me design the pens. We installed proper fencing, containment, and sanitation systems. Everything was clean, up to code, and thoroughly documented. I wasn't looking to start a side business. I was invoking my legal right to use my property for agricultural purposes, just as my grandfather had done nearly a century ago. When the county agriculture inspector came to review the setup, he walked the perimeter slowly, clipboard in hand. He tested runoff collection tanks, checked soil absorption levels, examined the drainage channels. When he finally looked up at me, his expression wasn't skeptical, it was impressed. "You're by the book," he said. "I've seen commercial farms with less discipline than this." Then, almost like an afterthought, he added, "Just make sure the runoff stays within the easement." But from the looks of it, this system's been designed to handle it. It had, because it already had, for generations. By the first week of October, everything was ready. The new drainage system was fully operational. The livestock pens were running clean and efficient. And legally, I was standing on granite solid ground. All I needed now was weather. It arrived in the form of a storm system so powerful it made the local news. 3 straight days of rain. Sheets of it, the kind that taps on your window all night and soaks the ground until the rivers swell and the creeks overrun. It was a kind of rain the land hadn't seen in years, and it arrived exactly when I needed it most. As the downpour intensified, I stood on my porch, watching the water flow. At first, it trickled through the channels gently, like a whisper returning to a long-forgotten path. Then it surged, gathering speed and force, carrying with it the natural runoff from my land, including the agricultural byproduct from the livestock pens. It wasn't sabotage. It wasn't manipulation. It was gravity, nature following the course it had always known. And it ran true, straight through the documented easement and into the very heart of Summit Creek. Walter called me just before midnight on the second night of rain. I could barely hear him through the laughter. "You are not going to believe this," he said, gasping between words. "They're holding their annual HOA Awards dinner at the Clubhouse tonight. Big crowd, black tie, and right in the middle of Marissa's speech." He paused for effect. The floor started to bubble. At first, people assumed it was a plumbing issue, but then the smell hit. Strong, pungent, unmistakably organic. Panic followed. High heels slipped in the rising water. Wine glasses shattered. Tables overturned as dozens of well-dressed homeowners scrambled for the exits, splashing through 2 inches of murky brown runoff that had risen up to the floorboards like a curse. The health department was called. Within an hour, the building was taped off, contaminated, condemned. The same structure they'd used as their bastion of control, the symbol of their clean, curated vision of progress, was now labeled a biohazard. And all of it, every ruined tile, every dollar in damages, was a natural consequence of ignoring the law, of building over something they had no right to touch. I hadn't broken a single rule. I hadn't raised my voice, thrown a punch, or called for retaliation. All I had done was let the land remember what they had tried to forget. The easement wasn't a loophole. It was a line they crossed, literally and legally. And the flood? That was the truth, rising from the roots. By dawn the next morning, the Summit Creek Clubhouse sat in stunned silence, cordoned off by bright yellow tape and the unmistakable stench of consequence. The once pristine building, the very one they'd used to lecture me about community standards, was now a certified biohazard zone. The health department had arrived overnight, conducted a full inspection, and wasted no time issuing an emergency condemnation. Their report was short, clinical, and devastating. Contamination due to failure to accommodate pre-existing agricultural drainage easement. It was the first time since the bulldozers tore through my land that I felt anything close to justice. But things were only just beginning to unravel for them. That morning, while the last of the soaked formalware was being hauled from the clubhouse by dry cleaning vans, Summit Creek's HOA board scrambled into damage control mode. They hastily relocated their next emergency meeting to the Elk Hollow High School gymnasium. The agenda? One line: Legal response to easement violation and community property damage. Of course, I wasn't invited, but Walter was. And Walter, bless him, didn't just attend. He recorded everything. Marissa stood at the front of the gym, visibly shaken but doing her best to appear in control. She pounded the podium, her voice shrill with fury. This was a deliberate act of sabotage, she told the room. This farmer, she couldn't even say my name, has funneled sewage into our community center out of spite. He's turned a loophole into a weapon, and we will respond with the full force of the law. She was met with a murmur of unease. Not everyone in that gym shared her conviction anymore. Many had started asking quiet questions. Questions about the legality of the clubhouse. Questions about the bulldozing of my crops. Questions about why the HOA president hadn't known about the easement in the first place. And then Ellen walked in, calm, composed, and utterly prepared. She introduced herself with a steady voice and began distributing copies of the easement documents to each board member. Some read quickly, some read slowly. But by the time she reached the front, the energy in the room had shifted entirely. My client, she said firmly, has simply exercised a right that has been legally recorded since 1937. The easement was never terminated, never reassigned, and never obstructed until your developers build a structure over it without proper disclosure or accommodation. Marissa's jaw clenched. This is absurd. You can't seriously expect us to accept that he has the right to flood our facility with animal waste. Ellen didn't flinch. She turned a page for the agreement and read aloud. The right of agricultural runoff and natural drainage shall remain intact for the benefit of the original landowner and his successors, without expiration or nullification unless formally revoked in writing. Then she looked up, locked eyes with the board, and delivered the knockout punch. This isn't just a document. It's a legally binding contract, and you build on top of it. You ignored it. That's not my client's fault. That's yours. The room fell silent. One board member, an older man in a blazer far too big for him, finally spoke. So you're saying we're liable? Ellen nodded. Not just liable. Vulnerable. This easement predates your subdivision, your permits, your bylaws. My client has every right to restore and use the drainage path. And frankly, you're lucky he's done so with this much restraint. The county environmental inspector, who had also been quietly invited to attend, stood to confirm what Ellen had said. He described the drainage setup in detail, explained that every measurement fell within compliance, confirmed that my livestock pens met sanitation standards, and that runoff had followed the documented path naturally, without artificial redirection. There had been no sabotage, no tampering, no criminal conduct, just the truth, doing what truth always does when given enough time, rising to the surface. Marissa, cornered and outnumbered, tried one final gambit. She announced that the HOA would be filing for an emergency injunction to stop me from using the easement further. But even that plan unraveled in real time. The county prosecutor, after reviewing the documentation in Ellen's brief, declined to press any charges or support the injunction. This appears to be a civil matter, he stated flatly. The drainage easement is valid. The farmer acted within his legal rights. Unless there's evidence of intentional malice, which we haven't found, there's no basis for criminal action. Marissa's mask cracked. Her voice rose. Her hands shook. Her once commanding presence now looked more like desperation in expensive shoes. Walter told me later that she stormed out of the gym, leaving behind a room full of anxious residents and a board scrambling to pick up the pieces. The following day, the HOA attempted to begin constructing a series of makeshift barriers to divert the drainage away from their clubhouse. But within hours, the county flood control office shut the project down. The work hadn't been permitted. Worse, their hastily built embankments risked redirecting runoff onto neighboring properties. You can't just dam up a historic easement because it's inconvenient now, the inspector said. That's not how any of this works. And then came the blow that Marissa never saw coming. The insurance company refused to pay. The HOA had filed a claim for over $230,000 in damages. Flooring, electrical systems, drywall, custom furniture, and more. but their policy included a specific exclusion clause for construction over unaccounted legal encumbrances. In plain terms, because they built over a legally active easement and failed to disclose it during underwriting, the damage wasn't covered. The claim was denied. Outright, no negotiation. And just like that, the financial burden fell squarely on the homeowners. The next HOA meeting was held in a church basement. There was no applause, no catered food, just folding chairs and angry voices echoing off the cinder block walls. Marissa stepped up to the front and, with forced poise, announced a special assessment, a one-time fee of $5,000 per household to cover the uninsured damages and begin legal proceedings against me. That was her final miscalculation. The room erupted. Shouts, protests, demands for answers. "You destroyed his cornfield," one resident said, pointing at the board. "Now we have to pay for your mistake." "You didn't check the records before bulldozing his land," said another. "You let your pride burn our money." Marissa tried to regain control, raising her voice over crowd, but the room no longer belonged to her. Walter stood up near the back, arms crossed. "You ignored a century of history," he said quietly, "and now the past is sending you the bill." She didn't respond, because there was nothing left to say. The chaos of that HOA meeting marked a turning point. What had begun as a coordinated assault against a lone farmer was now splintering into something far less controllable: accountability. For months, Marissa Langford had presented herself as the voice of vision, a forward-thinking leader shaping Summit Creek into the crown jewel of Elk Hollow. But now, under the fluorescent hum of a church basement and the weight of unexpected consequences, the cracks in her authority had split wide open. 5 board members resigned within a week. Not quietly, either. They submitted public statements, most of them hinting at regret, misdirection, and legal oversight. One even admitted during a phone interview with the local paper, "We relied too much on her version of events. We didn't do our due diligence. We didn't want to question her." But the community was no longer afraid to question her. The once unified front of suburban resistance had dissolved into 2 distinct camps: those still clinging to the illusion of HOA supremacy, and those now openly calling for reform, transparency, and, more surprisingly, reconciliation with me. And the voice leading that charge? Walter. He organized an informal gathering in his backyard one Saturday afternoon. Nothing official, no paperwork, just an invitation sent around via word of mouth, posted on a corkboard in the post office, and shared in the HOA's private Facebook group, where it gained far more traction than Marissa had expected. 30 neighbors showed up. Some brought lawn chairs. Others brought casseroles and folding tables. I arrived just after 2, uncertain, uncomfortable, still half expecting a trap. But what I walked into wasn't confrontation. It was a quiet reckoning. People wanted to hear my story, not just the parts twisted in HOA newsletters, not the legal jargon they barely understood. They wanted to know who I was, what this land had meant to my family, what we'd lost. So I told them. I stood beneath the shade of Walter's old maple tree, cleared my throat, and started at the beginning. I talked about Elijah Mercer arriving in Elk Hollow with nothing but a horse and a dream, about my father working through the Dust Bowl years, carrying water by hand, while other farms dried up and disappeared, about our transition into heritage corn, preserving genetic lines you couldn't find anywhere else in the country. I passed around photographs, black and white snapshots of my grandfather holding up ears of blue corn taller than a man's forearm, grainy Polaroid of my father teaching me to plant in rows so straight they looked drawn by a ruler. But I also talked about what had been destroyed, not just the crop, but the trust, the insult of watching your life's work dismissed as a nuisance, the heartbreak of realizing that your neighbors, people whose children you'd waved from the fields, had stood by while your soil was stripped bare. For a long time, no one said anything. Then a woman in her 40s, a mother I recognized but had never spoken to, broke the silence. "We moved here from the city because we wanted something real, something grounded. Our kids watch your corn grow from the back porch. We always said, that's where food really comes from." And then they just destroyed it, like it didn't matter. Her voice cracked slightly. Others nodded. Another neighbor admitted that when she bought her home, the real estate agent had described my cornfield as a bonus view. It had added value, authenticity, connection, and now they felt robbed of that, too. By the time the sun had dipped behind the trees, a quiet consensus had formed. What Marissa had called progress had, in fact, been a mistake, and not just a legal one, a moral one. It wasn't long before the tide began to shift in public as well. The local paper, which had previously refused to touch the story, worried about losing advertising from developers, finally published a front-page feature. Century Farm Fights Back, How One Man's Land Survived HOA Overreach. The tone was different, respectful, almost reverent. The piece included photos of my destroyed field, comparisons between the easement maps, and, most powerful of all, a picture of me in my wrinkled graduation suit, standing helpless as bulldozers carved through my legacy. That photo, captured by Ethan, my neighbor, went viral locally. The image of a man dressed for his daughter's doctorate ceremony, watching his land get torn apart, struck a nerve. Comments flooded in from all over the county and even beyond. This isn't just a farm story. It's a story about fighting for what's right. They destroyed history for a parking lot. Every HOA needs to read this before they bully another homeowner. Marissa, once untouchable, now found herself increasingly isolated. Her reputation, once polished and commanding, had soured into something brittle and defensive. Every attempt she made to regain control backfired. She called another special assessment meeting to increase legal funding and was met with boos. One resident, standing in the back, shouted, "You bulldoze our neighbors' crops. Now you want us to bankroll your cleanup." Even her inner circle began to fracture. A few of the original supporters publicly distanced themselves, while others stopped showing up altogether. Real estate listings in Summit Creek now included required disclosure. Ongoing legal dispute with adjacent agricultural property. Property values began to dip. Interest from buyers dropped. The narrative had shifted from community of progress to neighborhood in conflict. And me? I went back to my porch each night, sat with my boots crossed at the ankle, and watched the clouds move slowly over the remains of the cornfield. It was still bare in places, the soil churned and raw. But something was different now. Where there had once been silence and grief, now there was respect. The land was beginning to speak again. And this time, people were finally listening. Marissa Langford's resignation came not with a press conference, not even with a prepared statement, but in the quiet of a Tuesday evening HOA meeting held in a half-empty elementary school cafeteria. She stood before the remaining board members, her power all but gone, her voice no longer able to command a room, and offered up a line that was as empty as it was telling. I was only trying to increase property values for everyone. That was her legacy, not community, not stewardship, property values. By the time she stepped down, no one applauded. No one thanked her. She collected her folder, her designer handbag, and walked out under flickering fluorescent lights to a silence so dense it nearly hummed. Her house sat on the market for nearly 8 months. Eventually, it sold at a loss, 40% below what she'd paid. The final humiliation? The young couple who bought it stopped by my farm on move-in day. Kind eyes, soft handshakes. "We heard what happened," the husband said. "We're not here to fight you. We're honored to live next to a piece of real history." And just like that, the script flipped. Because now, the farm wasn't a nuisance. It was a cornerstone. Walter, who had become the unlikely hero of this story, was unanimously elected HOA board president. His first act wasn't political or symbolic. It was personal. He showed up at my front door one morning, no fanfare, no entourage, just a warm cup of coffee and a folder in his hand. "We'd like to start over," he said simply. Inside the folder was something I never expected to see, a formal offer of restitution. The board had voted to fully compensate me for the destroyed crops, every last ear of rare corn. They'd agreed to reimburse my legal fees. And, most surprising of all, they were publishing a public apology in the county newspaper. But that wasn't the part that got to me. What did was a covenant they'd included, a legally binding document signed by the new board, declaring that my farm would be protected from future interference. The HOA agreed in clear language that I had the right to maintain my agricultural operations, including livestock cultivation, irrigation, and use of the drainage easement, without harassment, legal obstruction, or aesthetic complaints. It was everything I'd been fighting for. Not revenge, not punishment, recognition. Ellen reviewed the offer and nodded with quiet satisfaction. It's more than fair, she said, and more importantly, it's final. But the most unexpected transformation wasn't legal. It was cultural. Summit Creek, a neighborhood once obsessed with perfectly edged lawns and homogeneous landscaping, began to rediscover something it didn't even know it had lost: identity. The new marketing committee, yes, they had one, approached me weeks later with a proposal. They wanted to rebrand the neighborhood, not as a modern enclave, but as a place rooted in heritage. They asked if I'd be willing to consult on the campaign, to help them shape a new vision, one that embraced the very thing Marissa tried to erase. Instead of fighting the farm, the committee chair said, "We want to feature it, make it something people move here for." And to my surprise, I agreed. Within a month, glossy brochures were printed, real estate listings updated. Summit Creek was no longer advertising clean, uniform landscapes. It was offering something more unique: protected agricultural heritage views. The idea of living beside a living, breathing, working farm was no longer a liability. It was a feature. A few months later, they broke ground on a community garden near the border between our properties. They invited me to help design it. I stood under the same sun that once beat down on bulldozers and surveyed the land that had been stripped bare and now was being planted, carefully, joyfully, by the very people who once tried to erase it. Children from the subdivision came with their parents to learn how to plant heirloom seeds. They asked questions, listened to stories. Volunteers helped me clear out the last broken debris from the field. One boy, no more than 10, knelt in the dirt and gently patted soil over a kernel of blue corn, whispering to it like it might hear him. And maybe it did, because that spring, for the first time since the destruction, the corn came back. Not all of it, not yet, but enough. Rows began to rise again, green and defiant, stretching toward the sky as if they knew they belonged. Some of the residents came out to help with planting. Others just watched, quiet and reverent. No one mentioned the bulldozers, but no one needed to. The act of planting was its own kind of amends. The season ended with a harvest that was more celebration than chore. Neighbors came with baskets. Kids helped shuck corn on the porch. Natalie, my daughter, the PhD in agricultural science, came home to speak at the first Heritage Corn Festival, hosted right there between the farm and the community garden. She stood before a crowd of 100 people and said something that stuck with me. This isn't just about food. This is about memory, about place, about protecting the things we can't rebuild once they're gone. And she was right, because now, in the very soil where they once tried to erase my family's legacy, new life had taken root, not just in crops, but in community. A community that finally understood something I had tried to protect all along, that some things are worth standing up for, that not everything sacred comes with a price tag, that history matters, and when given a chance, it can grow back stronger than ever. The plaque outside the rebuilt Summit Creek Clubhouse is small, brass, clean, understated. Most people pass it without a second glance, but I've read it more times than I can count. This structure exists in recognition of the historic Mercer Farm Easement, 1937, and in partnership with the agricultural legacy of Elk Hollow. That sentence, it carries the weight of everything we fought for. They rebuilt the clubhouse, this time the right way, engineered around a drainage channel, with a full easement compliance plan and stormwater management that wouldn't dare interrupt the natural flow again. The HOA took out a new insurance policy, and this time, the easement was front and center. It was the first time I saw accountability written in metal. But the real vindication didn't come from words etched in brass. It came from what rose back up from the soil. That fall, the restored Heritage Cornfield, once reduced to broken stalks and dust, won first prize at the State Agricultural Fair. Blue ribbon. Historical category. The same corn Marissa once dismissed as an eyesore was now being celebrated as a living connection to American farming history. The judges specifically noted its genetic purity and historical significance, citing it as a rare example of pre-industrial seed preservation. There's a photo of me holding the ribbon, wearing my old work jacket, grinning like a schoolboy. That photo now hangs next to my grandfather's deed in my hallway. Sometimes I pass it on the way to the kitchen and just stop, not because I'm proud of the win, because I'm humbled by what it took to earn it. We nearly lost everything, because someone mistook legacy for inconvenience. But we got it back, not by screaming, not by breaking rules, by knowing them better than the ones who tried to bury us. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it whispers through paper trails, water lines, and roots that refuse to die. Several of the old board members have stopped by over the months, not as officials, just as neighbors. One brought pie. Another brought her son to see the baby pigs. A third stood in the driveway a little too long before speaking. "I'm sorry," she said. "We got caught up in all that HOA stuff. We forgot to ask if it was right." I nodded. That was enough. We don't talk about Marissa anymore. Her name has faded into that strange part of community memory that people only mention in passing. If anything, she's become a cautionary tale, an example of what happens when power forgets purpose. Walter, now a close friend, visits often. We sit on the porch, drinking strong coffee, watching the wind move through the corn. He says he's still learning about farming, about water rights, about humility. He's even started volunteering at the county zoning office, helping draft new language that protects historic properties like mine from future exploitation. He told me once, sometimes it takes a flood to clear the air. And he was right. The county, perhaps in a quiet act of repentance, finally repealed the outdated 1954 nuisance ordinance that had been used to justify the bulldozing in the first place. They replaced it with a new resolution protecting legacy agricultural land and codified protections for pre-existing easements. Natalie, my daughter, included our case in her lectures on environmental law. She tells her students, there's a difference between following the rules and understanding why they exist. Some laws still carry the weight of forgotten hands. And if you look closely, those are the ones that protect us the most. I like to think Elijah Mercer would have smiled hearing that, because this wasn't just about me. It was about him, about every bucket he hauled in the 1930s, every fence my father mended during the farm crisis, every seed I planted hoping it would mean something more. Now it does. Each morning, I walk the edge of the field and run my hand along the stalks. The dew clings to my fingertips. The smell of soil is sharp and clean. Off in the distance, I can hear laughter, kids running to the community garden rows, learning how to plant the same blue corn I once feared would vanish forever. And every now and then, I catch someone staring, not with suspicion, but admiration, respect. I don't need their praise. But I'm grateful for their understanding, because the truth is, I never wanted to win a fight. I just want to be left in peace to do what my family always had, grow food, grow roots, grow something real, and somehow, through flood and fire, through arrogance and bulldozers and courtrooms, that's exactly what we did. The land remembers what people forget. And when people finally choose to remember, too, the harvest is better than anything you could have ever imagined. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you've ever had to stand up for something that couldn't be replaced. And remember, justice doesn't always come in noise. Sometimes it comes in knowing where to dig. Thanks for watching.